Good evening from Washington. I'm Larry O'Connor. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving. We begin tonight with growing unrest on the streets of China. How did this begin and where is it headed? Could this be another repeat of the Tiananmen Square protests? We bring in our friend Gordon Chang. He's a China expert, author of the book, The Coming Collapse of China. Gordon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Larry.
Well, first, it appears that these protests began as pushback against the draconian zero COVID policies of the authoritarian government out of Beijing. What sort of sparked this flame, as it were?
Thursday night, an apartment building in Urumqi, which is the capital of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and fire trucks couldn't get to the scene of the tragedy because of COVID barriers. And there's videos that the Chinese people saw of the water from the fire trucks not being able to reach the building. And that sparked the protests of Friday and of this weekend. Today, the streets of China are quiet, but the anger has not gone away. And the hatred of Xi Jinping and the disgust, that hasn't gone away either. So this is not the end of the story, Larry.
As much as we push back and complain about the lockdown protocols here, and properly so, by the way, because we are used to having a little bit of more autonomy and freedom and liberty. I almost feel like from our Western eyes, these protests in China look a little disjointed because this is wrong, and it may even be in some way sort of stereotypical, but we just assume that the Chinese people are used to this by now after decades of totalitarian rule. What's different?
I guess what's different is that there have been now 3 years of this, and people have just had enough. But there's also something else, and that is Xi Jinping's policies have caused economic downturns and the plunge in the property market. You know, about 70% of the wealth of the Chinese middle class are in apartment blocks that are vacant. And it's sort of like, Americans will buy gold coins, the Chinese buy apartments.
Huh.
And because of his policies and because of the policies of his predecessors, they've now finally reached the exhaustion point. And so there's just unhappiness in China all around.
Well, it is funny because we've spoken over the years, almost 10 years now, actually 10 years, Gordon, you and I have had these conversations about the Chinese economy. And we always heard how the Chinese economy is doing better than America and how, we're beholden to them because they hold our debt. But you always make the point that China needs our economy more than we need theirs, really. And is it possible that our economic downturn, our inflation, our loss of spending power here domestically in America, that's actually negatively affecting them in a huge way?
Yes, especially because over the last year or so, the Chinese economy has become even more dependent on exports. And we are by far the most important single export market for China. Mm-hmm. And the downturn that we saw, the decline in American consumer spending during COVID, that actually affected China.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing right now, Larry, is for other reasons, the COVID lockdowns. They have now affected manufacturing. They've affected consumption in China. And that has just negatively affected the country all around. And that's why there is this anger. In March and April, we saw the people jumping off their balconies in Shanghai. That was a warning that this was going to happen.
I wanted to ask you, because we've been mentioning this, we've shown some videos, some of them tragic, like you pointed out, some of them almost comical, where you see people in hazmat suits and gas masks carrying fully automatic weapons, trying to herd people at airports into certain lines in certain rooms with these crazy zero COVID policies. And I saw some of the protests appeared when the videos went viral, Gordon, this weekend. They appeared to be not just about the COVID lockdown policies, but about the jailing and imprisonment of protesters as well. So now you've got protests about the reaction to the protests. This is how we got Tiananmen Square back in the 80s, wasn't it?
Yes. And what we've also seen, Larry, are people in various places around China telling the police to leave. And we've actually seen pitched battles between protesters, workers, with the guys in those big white suits. They're called big whites.
Oh.
And the workers and the protesters in some of these are actually winning and driving the police away. So this has really become quite stunning. And, even for someone like me who doesn't believe in the strength of the communist system, I was taken aback by what we have witnessed over the last 3 weeks, because these protests are sort of a continuation of what's happened at that Apple iPhone plant. And those disturbances started at the end of last month.
Yeah. So, Gordon, the silence has been somewhat deafening from the White House. President Biden, of course, just met with Xi in a sort of an impromptu sidebar at the G20 meetings. What should the American government say right now? What should President Biden do?
The most important thing is for Biden, both publicly and privately, to tell Xi Jinping that there will be severe consequences if he uses force against the Chinese people. And because Biden is big on allies, I think he needs to talk to America's friends and partners to have their leaders give the same message to the Chinese. This is in contrast to what happened in 1989, because right afterwards, George H.W. Bush, I believe to his eternal shame, privately told the Chinese leadership, don't worry, America has your back. We're okay with your killing thousands of Chinese citizens. We need to send the opposite message this time.
The fact that we're seeing protesters congregate in Tiananmen Square certainly evokes the 1989 protests and the memories of those freedom fighters who were slaughtered. What do you expect the Xi government to do here? What do you expect their reaction to be?
I expect them in this coming days to round up protesters. China has the world's most sophisticated artificial intelligence and camera system for this purpose. And they can actually identify everybody in those protests, and they can give them a hard time. They can jail them. I think we're going to see them go after them. And this will work for a little while. But the anger that caused this explosion of protests across China over the last 3 days, that hasn't gone away. And that means that we're going to see this again in the not too distant future.
The Tiananmen protesters, they were all in their 20s. They were students. I mean, they'd be, in their mid-50s now, Gordon. And their children were raised in this China from the last 2 decades. How did the Tiananmen generation of 1989, how did they raise their children? What were the lessons learned from Tiananmen Square that they instilled in their kids?
Larry, that's a great question. I think that they probably didn't talk too much about it to their children because that would have been politically dangerous. Because the Communist Party tries to have kids tattle on their parents. We know that the party, Deng Xiaoping, who instituted the murderous crackdown, he wanted to tell the Chinese people that the Communist Party would go to any lengths to keep power. His successors, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping, have taken the opposite position. What they've tried to do is whitewash everything, make people forget about it. And so you got a lot of young people in China who have not heard of Tiananmen Square, or if they've heard about it, it was in the narrative that only soldiers died. So people, in China, they're not as afraid of the party as we think that they should be, because the party has tried to undo Deng Xiaoping's lesson.
So it's up to Western nations to make a decision, a moral decision about the cost of their smartphones and electronics that are coming from China versus the cost of human freedom and liberty that we see on the streets playing out right now in China. Let's see how that decision goes. Gordon Chang, always good to talk with you. An essential Twitter follow, by the way, Gordon G. Chang, if you want to be up to date on everything going on there. And again, his book, The Coming Collapse of China. Thank you, Gordon. More to come on O'Connor Tonight.